Hey everyone, I'm Robert Lee, and I am doing my research presentation on Cormac McCarthy's The Road. And the theme that I chose to focus on through some external research from an article on Jacob Pawning, from an article written by Jacob Pawning, is the recurring theme of death and how it shapes really a dismal outlook in the road, not just simply through a plot line, but through the setting, through um, character build, through the different aspects that the father and the son have to go through. It's really as I'll talk about in a little bit, kind of a lingering fog is the best way that I could describe it. And it's always there. It's kind of laying down throughout the entire novel and just kind of waiting, um, waiting as the story progresses. So as I mentioned, it's a death is a constant theme in this novel. It's a post-apocalyptic novel anyway. Excuse me, um, but it's not just a physical ending of sorts. McCarthy's vision of the apocalyptic countryside is filled with different scenarios, circumstances, and settings that are they're constantly overflowing with the death. Kind of that fog that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, and it's physical and metaphorical. It's talked about constantly. It's used in descriptions and even in dialogue, as you'll see in a little bit. Death is portrayed as an overarching, that lurking fog. It always seems to be there, between, around, over the man and son, and while also engulfing the land as they travel through the country trying to reach the coast. So, death and how does it find its place in the new world, and what does it how does McCarthy kind of embed it? But he uses the storyline of the road to personify death. It's not just the ending of life, so to speak, as we're used to, but it's the constant struggle that the father and child endure throughout the novel. Even when a moment of hope endures, there's several instances of positive, loving moments in the novel, but the plotline turns and kind of the death fills the land with darkness and hopelessness, even if it's not an actual death. It's something demeaning, it's something dark, it's something where death is kind of causing it. And a quote from page four would be barren, silent, godless. He thought the month was October, but he wasn't sure. He hadn't kept a calendar for years. They were moving south. There'd be no surviving another winter. So just a pretty obvious mention of kind of a how death can bring about um, this kind of scenario, even though we're not actually looking at death itself. So McCarthy also uses death through. So another mention of death through dialogue was on page 39. It's really far, he said. It's pretty far. Would you die if you fell? You'd get hurt. It's a long way. It's really scary. So another back and forth between the father and son, and not so much as dark as you might typically think of death, but um, it's just it alludes to it's always there. It's just part of the natural world in this post-apocalyptic environment. So the short snippet of dialogue, it gives you the reader a quick glimpse of fear, in just in one moment as they're traveling. So it's not only that the child is scared and asking his father for some help almost, but that the dialogue gives us insight into the environment and mindset of the characters as well. So I've mentioned a couple times that in this novel, death is kind of lingering. It's like it's almost an effect, so to speak. Um, And as the father and the son, they're discovering the stores, the houses, and even a bunker throughout the whole novel as they're traveling, um, trying to find the way to the coast. There always seems to be something nagging just behind them, and in some cases over them. Um, Even if briefly and not permanent, it just kind of comes and goes, but it's always in the background. And that nagging feeling is death. So Pawning gives us a glimpse of his views on this idea and how the man seems to be facing the inevitable truth through the adventure. So, quote, the road, however, follows a path southeast across the Appalachian Mountains, the territory of McCarthy's first novels, to the Atlantic Ocean. It is as if the man is unconsciously trying to undo time. He is a mortally wounded animal traveling back to his den, a pilgrim retracing his back trail to the origin of the manifestation of a destiny he wishes to undo. So it's like it's an inevitable ending that he is trying to almost escape, and yet he understands what's happening. So probably one of the most interesting and important aspects of death in the novel is how McCarthy uses it in his setting. So he's strikingly effective at describing the setting of his novel, both constantly through the unique writing style he has, and also how he uses death as a constant reminder that the world has changed and the landscape around them has forever altered to kind of fit this mold. Another quote from page 121. Then he stopped. What had he seen? A drain pipe, a trellis, the dark serpentine of a dead vine running down it like the track of some enterprise upon a graph. So he's just describing a little portion of a trellis almost, but he's using death as a dark and an almost like an intriguing insight into um, how the world has changed through the apocalypse and how death is there all the time. So death is also kind of used as a destination in in this novel. So Pawning talks about the distinct characterization McCarthy gives in his descriptions of not only the world surrounding the expedition in the novel, but of the way imagination takes hold as a constant theme. Not just that death is the end experience, but it's portrayed and felt as the inevitable destination. But Pawning says this becomes not only a tale of the profound nature of a father's love in the face of a hopeless world, as well as mortality. Talk about the consequences of disregarding the earth and its mystery, but a narrative poem on the beauty of imagination, which grows brighter in the harshest of circumstances. So, inevitably, I wanted to talk about the ending of the novel. Not to get too deep into the spoilers, but I think it's a little bit inevitable with this presentation. Um, so, as the end of the novel draws near, and the boy understands that his father is gone, and he's kind of sitting there, just kind of hunched over, wrapped in blankets. Um, McCarthy adds in kind of a final touch of love to complement death, and I think that was important because he's using contrast throughout the whole novel, but this instance he's contrasting death with even more sadness, with a little bit of love, and almost what's going to happen next. Is death still lingering ahead, or is it going to be something completely new? And the son is going to go on with the new family and pursue something the opposite direction of death. So he walked back into the woods and knelt beside his father. He was wrapped in a blanket as the man had promised, and the boy didn't uncover him, but he sat beside him, and he was crying, and he couldn't stop. He cried for a long time. I'll talk to you every day, he whispered. Although it felt somewhat inevitable, although perhaps we didn't really know what character it would be inevitable for in terms of death, who would it take? Death was lingering through the novel all along. Although the dangerous perils the man and the son faced, each day felt lined with a lingering death on multiple levels. So just some final thoughts, and kind of how Pawnings thought about and what I found in my research. But he summarizes the ending as a culmination of many feelings, death being prominent and constant, and it's kind of fleshed out in an absolute state. While the boy is left to contend with new beginnings, it's also a clever way of contrasting death, as I mentioned a second ago. So, from a quote from Pawning in the Road, McCarthy never lets the reader forget that his characters are human beings, a man and a boy dealing with realities that all humans must face: relationships, love, fear, and ultimately death. This realism is part of what makes the ending so enticing. It seems wrong not to argue for a happy ending for this boy. It even feels as if there was an obligation placed on the reader to accept this heartbreakingly jarring happy ending. So, as the novel finishes up and the boy is left to see what happens with his new quote family, his father just sitting there dead. um, I think it was about as fitting of an ending as we could expect. Not that it was necessarily anticipated. I certainly didn't quite anticipate it. um, but it gives an exclamation of where death is in the novel, and finally how it sits at the end, um, complementing the the scenario throughout the entire novel, and also as a means of culmination to finishing the novel.